The she-wolf's eyes gleamed like amber coins in the dying light as Garrett raised his rifle, his breath forming clouds in the freezing Montana air. 3 tiny shapes huddled behind her in the snow, barely moving, their ribs showing through matted fur. The woman at the general store in Redemption had been right when she'd warned him about the brutal winter of 1887. What she hadn't mentioned was that it would drive the wild things down from the mountains, desperate and dangerous. If you're enjoying the story of survival and unexpected connections, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our next chapter. Your support means everything to our channel. Garrett's finger trembled on the trigger, not from cold, but from something he couldn't name. The wolf didn't snarl or snap. She simply stood there between him and her pups, her body language speaking a language older than words. Her message was clear: kill me if you must, but my babies need shelter. The ranch house behind him had been silent for 3 months, ever since Martha's cough had turned to blood and the doctor from town had arrived too late. The barn was half empty. The cattle sold off to pay debts he could barely remember accumulating. What was one more mouth to feed in this godforsaken wilderness? He lowered the rifle slowly, watching the wolf's ears twitch forward in cautious acknowledgement. This was madness, pure and simple. Wolves killed livestock, attacked horses, and no self-respecting rancher would ever consider what he was about to do. But Garrett hadn't been a self-respecting rancher for a long time. He'd been a ghost haunting his own property, going through motions that had lost all meaning. The wolf took one tentative step forward, then another, her golden eyes never leaving his face. Behind her, the smallest pup whimpered, a sound so pitiful it cut through the wind like a blade. The sun was setting fast, painting the snow-covered plains in shades of orange and purple that Martha would have loved. She'd always seen beauty in this harsh land, even when Garrett could only see the work that needed doing. He'd promised her he'd keep the ranch going, but what was the point of keeping promises to ghosts? The temperature was dropping fast, and those pups wouldn't survive another night exposed to the elements. Neither would their mother. By the look of her, her coat was dull and patchy, and he could count her vertebrae from 20 feet away. Garrett made a decision that would have had his neighbors calling him crazy, assuming he'd had any neighbors within 15 miles. He backed toward the barn, keeping the rifle ready but pointed at the ground. The wolf watched him with those impossibly intelligent eyes, her body tense as a coiled spring. When he pulled open the barn door, the hinges screamed in protest, sending his old horse Charlie into a nervous whinny from his stall. The wolf's ears flattened against her skull at the sound, but she didn't run. She understood what he was offering, even if she didn't trust it yet. The barn still held some warmth from the afternoon sun trapped in the wooden walls, and there was fresh straw in the empty stalls. Garrett gestured toward the far corner, away from Charlie, where an old horse blanket lay crumpled on the ground. The wolf didn't move for a long moment, her body rigid with suspicion and exhaustion. Then she turned her head and made a sound Garrett had never heard a wolf make before, a low, gentle rumble that brought the 3 pups stumbling through the snow toward her. They were gray and white, their fur crusted with ice, their legs shaking so badly they could barely walk. The smallest one collapsed halfway to the barn, and without thinking, Garrett stepped forward and scooped it up. The pup was lighter than a sack of grain, its heartbeat fluttering against his palm like a trapped bird. The mother wolf's lips pulled back from her teeth in an automatic response, but she didn't lunge. Their eyes met across the frozen space between them, predator and man, both pushed to the edges of survival, both protecting something they couldn't afford to lose. Garrett carried the pup into the barn and set it gently on the horse blanket. The mother herded the other 2 inside, moving slowly, never taking her eyes off him. When all 3 pups were huddled together in the corner, she positioned herself between them and Garrett, her body a living shield. Charlie stamped nervously in his stall, but Garrett spoke to him in a low, calm voice that had soothed countless frightened animals over the years. The horse settled, though his eyes remained wide and white-rimmed. Garrett knew he should leave, close the barn door, and return to the empty house where Martha's knitting still sat in its basket beside the coal fireplace. Instead, he found himself sitting down on an overturned bucket about 10 feet from the wolves, the rifle across his knees, but no longer gripped with intent to use it. The mother wolf's breathing was labored, her sides heaving with each breath. She was in worse shape than he'd thought. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the barn walls and whistling through gaps in the old wood. Snow began to fall in earnest, the kind of heavy, wet snow that could bury a man or animal who wasn't prepared for it. Garrett thought about the venison hanging in his smokehouse, about the pot of beans he'd made 3 days ago that he'd been eating from mechanically without tasting. He thought about Martha's voice telling him that every creature deserved a chance, even the ones that seemed dangerous, especially the ones that seemed dangerous, because weren't they just scared and fighting to survive like everyone else? The smallest pup whimpered again, and the mother wolf bent her head to nuzzle it, her movements tender despite her exhaustion. Garrett watched this display of maternal devotion and felt something crack open inside his chest, something that had been frozen solid since the day he'd buried Martha on the hill overlooking the ranch. He stood slowly, and the wolf's head snapped up, her muscles tensing. But Garrett just moved to the barn door, stepped outside into the swirling snow, and headed for the smokehouse. Behind him, in the dim warmth of the barn, for sets of eyes watched him go, not with trust, not yet, but with the faintest stirring of hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd found shelter from more than just a storm. Garrett returned to the barn carrying strips of venison wrapped in cloth, his boots crunching through snow that was already ankle-deep and rising. The storm had arrived in full force, the kind of blizzard that could last for days and leave a man trapped in his own home, cut off from the world. He pushed the barn door open against the wind's resistance and slipped inside, shutting it quickly behind him to preserve what warmth they had. The wolf was exactly where he'd left her, a sentinel standing guard over her pups, though he noticed she'd shifted slightly, allowing them to nurse. The smallest one was too weak to latch on properly, its head lolling to the side even as it tried. He approached slowly, keeping his movements predictable and non-threatening, the way he'd learned to move around spooked horses and injured cattle. The wolf's eyes tracked him with fierce intensity, but she didn't growl or bare her teeth. Garrett knelt down about 8 feet away and unwrapped the venison, the smell of smoked meat filling the barn immediately. Charlie nickered from his stall, hoping for his own share, but Garrett ignored him for now. He tore off a small piece of meat and tossed it gently toward the wolf. It landed in the straw a few feet in front of her, and for a moment she just stared at it, then at him, as if trying to understand the trick or the trap. Her hunger won out over her caution. She stretched her neck forward, keeping her body positioned protectively over the pups, and snatched the meat. She swallowed it almost without chewing, and Garrett saw her whole body shudder with the relief of having food in her belly. He tossed another piece, then another, watching as she devoured each one with desperate efficiency. When he'd given her about half the meat he'd brought, he stopped and sat back on the bucket, giving her space to digest and decide her next move. The pups had stopped nursing and were sleeping now, their tiny bodies rising and falling with breath that seemed stronger than it had been an hour ago. The night settled in around them, and with it came the bone-deep cold that Montana winters were famous for. Garrett knew he should return to the house, bank the fire in the stove, and try to get some sleep. But something kept him in the barn, watching this wild creature who'd chosen his property as her last desperate refuge. The wolf had laid down now, curling her body around her pups to share what little warmth she had left. In the lantern light, he could see the extent of her injuries more clearly. There was a long scar across her shoulder, fairly fresh, probably from a fight with another predator, or maybe even a trap she'd managed to escape. Her left ear had a chunk missing from it, and her coat was so thin in places he could see skin underneath. Garrett thought about the hunting party that had passed through Redemption a few weeks ago. City men from back east looking for trophies to hang on their walls. They'd been offering bounties for wolf pelts, $50 for a male, $25 for a female. The owner of the general store, a man named Samuel Hodge, had been enthusiastic about it, talking about how wolves were a menace that needed to be eliminated. Garrett had listened to the conversation without commenting, the way he listened to most things these days, present but not really participating in the world around him. Looking at his mother and her pups now, he wondered what Samuel Hodge would think of his decision to shelter them. Nothing charitable, that was certain. The smallest pup woke up crying, a thin sound that barely rose above the wind howling outside. The mother immediately began licking it, trying to stimulate it, encourage it to nurse again. But the pup seemed too weak, its movements sluggish and uncoordinated. Garrett had seen this before with calves and foals. the ones that came into the world already fighting a losing battle. Martha had always refused to give up on them, staying up all night with bottles and warm blankets, whispering encouragement to creatures that couldn't understand her words, but somehow understood her intent. She'd saved more than she'd lost, her determination overcoming odds that would have defeated a lesser person. Without fully deciding to do it, Garrett found himself moving closer to the wolf and her pups. The mother's eyes widened, and she pulled her lips back in warning. But Garrett spoke to her in the same low, steady voice he'd used with Charlie. He told her about Martha, about how she'd nursed a premature foal through 3 weeks of touch-and-go survival, about how she believed that stubbornness could overcome just about anything if you applied it correctly. The wolf didn't understand the words, but she heard something in his tone that made her hesitate. When Garrett reached out slowly toward the smallest pup, she watched but didn't strike. His hand closed gently around the tiny animal, and he lifted it carefully, bringing it close to his chest for warmth. The pup was barely responsive, its eyes still closed, its breathing shallow and irregular. Garrett had kept some of Martha's medical supplies, including the glass bottles and rubber nipples she'd used for orphan animals. He'd told himself he kept them because it seemed wasteful to throw away perfectly good equipment, but maybe he'd known on some level that he'd need them again. The barn had a small wood stove in the corner that he'd used during particularly brutal winters when the animals needed extra heat. He lit it now with matches from his pocket, coaxing the kindling into flame and adding larger pieces of wood until a decent fire was crackling behind the iron grate. While the stove warmed the barn, Garrett went back to the house and retrieved one of the bottles, some goat milk he'd gotten from a traveling peddler the week before, and an old wool blanket. The snow was coming down so thick he could barely see 5 feet in front of him, and the wind cut through his coat like knives. Inside the house, everything was exactly as he'd left it that morning. The dishes from breakfast still in the sink, the fire in the stove burned down to embers, Martha's shawl hanging on its hook by the door. He grabbed what he needed and hurried back to the barn, already feeling the numbness in his fingers and toes from the brief exposure. The mother wolf was pacing anxiously when he returned, making small, distressed sounds that Garrett recognized as the universal language of a mother separated from her child. He showed her the pup, still alive, still breathing, then sat down and warmed the goat milk using a small pan he kept in the barn for mixing supplements for sick animals. When the milk was body temperature, he filled the bottle and tested it on his wrist the way Martha had taught him. The pup's mouth was so small he had to use his smallest finger to encourage it to open, and even then, getting the nipple in position was a delicate operation that required more patience than he'd exercised in months. At first, the pup didn't respond, its reflexes too weak to engage with the bottle. But Garrett persisted, squeezing tiny drops of milk onto its tongue, massaging its throat gently to encourage swallowing. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 minutes, the pup latched on and began to suckle weakly. Garrett felt a surge of something he'd almost forgotten existed. Satisfaction at a job well done. Pleasure at seeing a living thing fight for survival and win, even if it was just one small battle in a longer war. The mother wolf had stopped pacing and was watching him intently, her head tilted slightly to one side in what looked almost like curiosity mixed with cautious approval. When the pup had taken as much milk as Garrett thought it could handle without making itself sick, he wrapped it carefully in the wool blanket and placed it back with its siblings. The mother wolf immediately began examining it, sniffing it thoroughly, checking that it was unharmed. Apparently satisfied that Garrett hadn't done anything terrible to her baby, she settled back down and allowed all 3 pups to nestle against her. The warmth from the stove was spreading through the barn now, taking the deadly edge off the cold, and Charlie had finally relaxed enough to doze in his stall. Garrett should have left then. He should have gone back to the house, to his own bed, to the routine of solitary survival he'd established. Instead, he found himself pulling another horse blanket from the tack room and settling onto a pile of straw about 6 feet from the wolf family. The mother watched him with those golden eyes, still wary but no longer actively hostile. They'd established something tonight, some kind of unspoken agreement that neither of them fully understood, but both recognized as significant. Outside, the storm raged on, burying the world in white, isolating them further from civilization. Inside the barn, 2 unlikely survivors kept vigil through the long winter night. neither quite trusting the other, but both willing to try. As Garrett's eyes began to close, heavy with exhaustion he'd been fighting for months, he heard Martha's voice in his memory, telling him that the hardest part of living wasn't the work or the loneliness or even the grief. The hardest part was choosing to keep going when everything inside you wanted to stop, finding reasons to get up in the morning when all the old reasons were gone. Maybe that's what the wolf had done when she'd brought her pups to his ranch, instead of lying down in the snow and accepting defeat. Maybe that's what he was doing now, feeding animals he should have turned away, sitting in a freezing barn instead of his empty house. Maybe survival wasn't about being strong or smart or prepared. Maybe it was just about being too stubborn to quit, even when quitting would be so much easier than continuing to care about anything at all. Garrett woke to the sound of Charlie's anxious whinnying and pale dawnlight filtering through gaps in the barn walls. His body ached from sleeping on the straw, and for a disorienting moment, he forgot where he was and why. Then he saw the wolf, standing alert near the barn door, her hackles raised and her attention fixed on something outside. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind an eerie silence broken only by Charlie's distress and a sound that made Garrett's blood run cold. Men's voices, rough and getting closer, accompanied by the baying of hunting dogs. He scrambled to his feet, every muscle protesting, and moved quickly to the small window beside the door. Through the frost-covered glass, he could see 3 riders approaching through snow that came up to their horses' chests. He recognized Samuel Hodge from the general store, accompanied by 2 of the bounty hunters who'd been through town, their rifles clearly visible against the white landscape. The dogs, 4 of them, were straining at their leads, their noses to the ground, following a scent trail that could only lead one place. Garrett heart hammered against his ribs as he realized what must have happened. The wolf's tracks from yesterday, leading directly to his barn, covered by snow, but not before the dogs had found them this morning. The mother wolf had backed away from the door and positioned herself in front of her pups, who were awake now and huddling together in the corner where Garrett had fed the smallest one through the night. That tiny pup looked stronger this morning. Its eyes finally open, its movements more coordinated. All 3 of them would die if those men got into the barn, and the mother wolf knew it. She looked at Garrett with an expression that was almost human in its desperation and determination, a look that said she would fight to her last breath, but knew she could win against rifles and dogs and 3 grown men. Garrett grabbed his own rifle from where he'd left it propped against the wall and stepped outside, pulling the barn door shut firmly behind him. The cold hit him like a physical blow, the temperature having dropped even further overnight. His breath came out in thick clouds as he called out to the approaching riders, his voice rough from disuse and the dry winter air. Samuel Hodge pulled his horse to a stop about 20 feet away, the 2 bounty hunters flanking him on either side. The dogs were going crazy now, barking and lunging toward the barn, their training telling them that their quarry was close and cornered. Samuel was a thick-set man in his 50s with a gray beard and eyes that calculated profit in every interaction. He'd been decent enough to Martha, extending credit when times were tight, but Garrett had never particularly liked or trusted him. Now, looking at the eager greed in Samuel's expression as he gestured toward the barn, Garrett liked him even less. Samuel called out that his dogs had tracked a wolf and her pups to Garrett's property, said they had every right to collect a bounty, claimed he was doing Garrett a favor by eliminating dangerous predators before they could kill livestock. His tone was friendly enough, but there was an edge underneath it, a warning that Garrett better not interfere with what Samuel considered legitimate business. Garrett planted himself firmly in front of the barn door and told them there were no wolves on his property. His voice was steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system, despite knowing that these 3 men could easily overpower him if they decided to. Samuel's friendly expression faltered, replaced by confusion and then irritation. He pointed out that his dogs didn't lie, that the tracks led right to Garrett's barn, that everyone knew wolves were a menace that needed to be dealt with. One of the bounty hunters, a lean man with a scar across his cheek and cold eyes that had seen too much violence, spat tobacco juice into the snow and suggested that maybe Garrett was getting soft in his old age, living alone out here with nothing but ghosts for company. The comment about ghosts hit harder than any physical blow could have, but Garrett didn't flinch. He told them again that there were no wolves here, that his dog had chased off a coyote yesterday, and that's probably what their hounds were smelling. It was a weak lie and everyone knew it, but Garrett delivered it with enough conviction to create a moment of doubt. Samuel's eyes narrowed as he studied Garrett, trying to figure out what was happening here. Why a man who'd always followed the rules was suddenly standing in his way. Behind Garrett, inside the barn, he could hear the wolf moving, probably positioning herself for the fight she knew was coming. Charlie whinnied again, sensing the tension, and the dogs redoubled their efforts to break free from their handlers. The second bounty hunter, younger than the first but with the same hard edge to him, suggested they just push past Garrett and check the barn themselves. He said it casually, but his hand had moved to rest on his rifle, and the threat was clear enough. Samuel held up a hand to stop him, his businessman's brain working through the situation. He reminded Garrett that there was $75 in bounties at stake, that it was a lot of money for wolves that were going to die anyway, that Garrett could use that kind of cash given how the ranch had been struggling. The offer hung in the cold air between them, a test to see if Garrett's resistance was about principle or just a negotiating tactic to get a share of the money. Garrett thought about $75, about how many months of supplies it would buy, about the repairs the ranch house needed, about the livestock he could purchase come spring. He thought about Martha's medical bills, still unpaid, sitting in a drawer in the kitchen where he tried not to look at them. $75 was real money, enough to change things, enough to matter. But then he thought about the smallest pup, barely alive yesterday, drinking from a bottle in his hands, fighting with every ounce of strength it possessed to stay in a world that didn't want it. He thought about the mother wolf's eyes when she'd chosen to trust him instead of running, about the unspoken agreement they'd made in the darkness of the storm. He told Samuel and the bounty hunters that they needed to leave his property now, that he had work to do and didn't have time for this nonsense. His hand tightened on his rifle, not raising it, but making it clear he would if necessary. The temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees as the five men stared at each other across the snow, the only sounds a panting of the dogs and the wind starting to pick up again. Samuel's face had gone red, whether from cold or anger Garrett couldn't tell. He started to say something about how this wasn't over, about how Garrett was making a serious mistake. But the scarred bounty hunter interrupted him. The scarred man said something that made the situation infinitely worse. He'd heard rumors in town that Garrett had gone strange after his wife died, that he'd stopped going to church, stopped socializing, stopped acting like a normal person. He suggested that maybe Garrett wasn't thinking clearly, that grief did funny things to a man's mind, that perhaps they should inform the sheriff that Garrett might be a danger to himself. It was a calculated move, threatening not just to take the wolves, but to call into question Garrett's sanity, his ability to manage his own affairs. In a time and place where a man could be declared incompetent and lose everything, it was a threat with real teeth. Garrett felt rage building in his chest, hot and fierce, the first strong emotion besides grief he'd felt in months. These men, who knew nothing about his life or his loss or what he'd been through, presumed to judge him, to threaten him, all for the sake of some blood money they didn't even need. Samuel, he knew, owned half of redemption and didn't acquire bounty hunting to pay his bills. The two hunters were just bored rich men playing at being frontiersmen, treating living creatures like targets in a shooting gallery. None of them understood what was happening here, the significance of the choice Garrett was making, the line he was drawing. He raised his rifle then, not pointing at anyone, but bringing it up across his chest in a posture that was unmistakably defensive. He told them one last time to leave, and this time his voice had gone quiet and flat, the tone of a man who had nothing left to lose and was therefore the most dangerous kind of opponent. Samuel must have recognized something in that voice or that stance, because he pulled his horse back a few steps. The younger bounty hunter looked like he wanted to push the issue, but the scarred one grabbed his arm and shook his head. They'd been in enough tight situations to recognize when a man had reached his limit, when pushing further would mean bloodshed that nobody really wanted. Samuel said they'd be back with the sheriff, that Garrett would regret this decision, that protecting wolves over his fellow men showed exactly how far he'd fallen. But he turned his horse around and started back through the snow, the bounty hunters following after a long moment of staring at Garrett with expressions that promised future trouble. The dogs were pulled away, still barking, their frustrated baying echoing across the white landscape. Garrett stood in front of the barn door until the three men were out of sight, his body shaking now that the confrontation was over, his mind racing through the implications of what he'd just done. When he finally turned and opened the barn door, the wolf was right there, so close he could have reached out and touched her. She'd been waiting just inside, ready to fight alongside him if it had come to that. This wild creature who barely knew him offering the only alliance she could. Their eyes met and held for a long moment, predator and man. Both outlaws now in their own ways, both having chosen a path that would bring consequences neither could fully predict. Garrett stepped inside and closed the door against the cold and the world beyond it, knowing that he'd just declared war on his own community for the sake of her lives, that most people would consider worthless. Martha would have been proud of him, he thought. Or maybe she would have called him a fool. Probably both. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange rhythm that Garrett had never experienced before, a dance of mutual survival between man and wolf that defied everything he'd been taught about the natural order. The mother wolf, whom he'd started calling Luna in his mind, though he never spoke the name aloud, had gradually relaxed her guard enough to allow him closer to the pups. The smallest one, the fighter who'd taken milk from a bottle on that first desperate night, had grown stronger each day, its coat filling out and its movements becoming more coordinated and playful. All 3 pups had survived, against odds that should have defeated them, and Garrett found himself checking on them multiple times a day with an anxiety that reminded him uncomfortably of how he'd felt waiting for Martha's condition to improve. No one from town had come back to the ranch, but Garrett knew it was only a matter of time. Samuel Hodge wasn't a man who forgot perceived insults, and the sheriff, a practical fellow named William Cordell, would eventually have to investigate the claims that Garrett was harboring wolves and possibly losing his mind. In preparation, Garrett had started making plans he never thought he'd need to make. He'd scouted the northern section of his property, where the land rose into foothills that eventually became mountains, identifying caves and sheltered areas where a wolf family might den safely once the pups were strong enough to travel. He'd also begun the delicate process of teaching Luna to trust him enough that she'd follow when the time came to relocate them. The teaching went both ways. Luna showed him things about survival he'd never considered, despite decades of living on this land. She taught him how to read the wind for approaching weather changes, how to identify the subtle signs that predators were near, how to move through snow without leaving obvious tracks. She communicated through body language, so precise it was almost a spoken language. The angle of her ears, the position of her tail, the way she held her weight. Garrett found himself learning this language, responding to it, becoming something other than fully human in the process. When he returned to the house each evening, he felt like he was putting on a costume, pretending to be the civilized rancher he'd once been while his real self lived in a barn with creatures the world wanted dead. The pups were growing at an astonishing rate, their puppy awkwardness giving way to the first hints of the predators they'd become. They'd started fighting with each other, tumbling through the straw, and making sounds that were surprisingly joyful. The smallest one, the fighter, had claimed Garrett as a particular fascination, approaching him with a boldness her siblings didn't share, sniffing his boots, and once even placing her tiny paw on his knee as if testing whether he was real or some strange dream her young mind had conjured. Luna watched these interactions carefully but didn't interfere, seeming to understand that Garrett posed no threat to her children. Charlie had adapted to his unusual barn mates with surprising equanimity, though he still gave the wolf family a wide berth. Garrett suspected the old horse appreciated the company after months of isolation, even if that company came in an unconventional form. The barn had become a sanctuary, a place outside normal rules and expectations, where species that should have been enemies had instead become something like a family. Garrett knew it couldn't last, that the world beyond the barn walls would eventually force itself back in, but for these stolen weeks, he allowed himself to exist in this bubble of unlikely peace. On a morning when the sun finally broke through weeks of gray clouds, making the snow sparkle like scattered diamonds, Garrett was in the barn reinforcing the door when he heard horses approaching. His stomach dropped, but when he looked out, he saw only one rider, a woman he recognized as Doc Ramsey's wife, Eliza, bundled in furs against the cold. She pulled her horse to a stop a respectful distance from the barn and called out, asking if she could speak with him. Her tone was friendly, non-threatening, and Garrett stepped outside cautiously, positioning himself as always between the world and the wolves he was protecting. Eliza Ramsey was a forthright woman in her 40s who'd come west with her husband 15 years ago and had earned respect and redemption by being useful rather than proper. She helped Martha during her illness, sitting with her when Garrett had needed to tend the ranch, never charging for her time or acting like it was charity. She told Garrett now that word had spread through town about his confrontation with Samuel Hodge, that opinions were divided, and that he should know the sheriff was planning to ride out within the next few days. But she said something else too, something Garrett hadn't expected. She said Martha had told her once about Garrett's capacity for compassion, about how he'd been the one to insist they'd taken a pregnant cat that had been abandoned by travelers, even though they'd ended up with 7 cats for months afterward until they could find homes for the kittens. Eliza said she didn't know exactly what Garrett was protecting in his barn, and she didn't need to know, but that she trusted Martha's judgment of character and figured if Garrett had decided something was worth standing up for, it probably was. She brought supplies: salted meat, flour, coffee, and medicine for both humans and animals. She said it was payment for a debt she'd never properly settled from when Garrett had helped repair her husband's office roof 2 summers ago. It wasn't really about any debt. They both knew that. But the fiction allowed her to help without making Garrett feel like he was accepting charity. As she prepared to leave, she mentioned casually that the mountain pass about 15 miles north was still navigable, that it led to wild country where a person or animal could disappear if they needed to, and that the next big storm was probably 3 days away. After Eliza left, Garrett stood in the cold sunlight, holding the supplies she'd brought and feeling something he'd almost forgotten: gratitude that other people existed, that kindness still operated in a world that often seemed designed only for cruelty and survival. He carried the supplies into the barn and found Luna watching him with her usual intensity. The pups were sleeping in a pile, their bellies full from the rabbit Garrett had trapped and prepared for them that morning. He sat down on his usual bucket and spoke aloud, telling Luna that they couldn't stay here much longer, that danger was coming, and that he had a plan, but it would require her trust in a way she'd never given before. Over the next 3 days, Garrett prepared for the journey north. He fashioned a travois that could be pulled behind Charlie, designed to carry the pups when they got tired. He packed supplies for a week in the wilderness, including extra food for Luna and materials to build temporary shelter. He studied his father's old maps, planning a route that would keep them away from main trails and the few scattered ranches in the area. And he spent hours working with Luna, teaching her to walk beside Charlie without spooking the horse, getting her accustomed to the sight of the travois, building the partnership they'd need to survive what was coming. On the morning of the 4th day, dark clouds gathered on the western horizon, promising the storm Eliza had predicted. Garrett loaded the travois, led Charlie out of the barn, and called to Luna. She emerged cautiously, the pups trailing behind her, their young eyes wide at the vast white world beyond the barn. The smallest pup, the fighter, stayed closest to Garrett's heels, her trust in him absolute in a way that made his chest ache. They set out toward the mountains as the first snow began to fall, an unlikely caravan that would have been comic if the stakes weren't so deadly serious. The journey was harder than Garrett had anticipated. The snow deepened as they climbed, and the temperature dropped until his breath crystallized in his beard. The pups rode on the travois part of the time, but Luna refused to get on it, running alongside with tireless determination. Several times they had to stop and wait out wind gusts so strong they threatened to knock everyone off their feet. Garrett's fingers went numb despite his gloves, and his face felt like it was being cut by thousands of tiny knives. But Luna kept going, kept trusting him to lead her family to safety, and her faith gave him strength when his own was failing. They reached the cave system Garrett had scouted just as full darkness fell, the storm now a howling monster that threatened to erase their tracks as quickly as they made them. The largest cave was deep enough to provide real shelter, with a narrow entrance that could be defended and enough space inside for all of them. Garrett got a fire going while Luna inspected every inch of the cave, making sure it was safe for her pups. When she was satisfied, she allowed them to settle near the fire's warmth, their small bodies pressed against each other for additional heat. Garrett knew he should head back to the ranch before the storm made travel impossible, but exhaustion and something else kept him in the cave that night. He fed the fire, shared his supplies with Luna, and watched the pups sleep with their bellies full and their fur warm. The smallest one had curled up against his leg, using him as a pillow, and he didn't have the heart to move her. Luna lay nearby, her golden eyes reflecting firelight, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked completely relaxed, the constant vigilance temporarily set aside. In the morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed and pristine. Garrett prepared to leave, knowing the wolves would be safe here, that Luna could hunt in these mountains and raise her pups away from humans who saw them only as targets. But as he packed his gear, Luna did something unexpected. She approached him and pressed her head briefly against his hand, a gesture of gratitude and farewell that was more meaningful than any words could have been. The pups, even the fighter, stayed back this time, instinctively understanding that this was goodbye, that the strange two-legged creature who'd saved them was returning to his own world. Garrett made it back to the ranch by late afternoon, exhausted but feeling more alive than he had in months. The barn seemed empty without its unusual residents, but also lighter somehow, as if the purpose had been fulfilled and completed. He returned to the house, built up the fire, and sat in Martha's chair for the first time since her death. He imagined telling her about Luna and the pups, about standing up to Samuel Hodge, about the journey into mountains. He imagined her smile, the way she would have said she knew he had it in him all along, that stubbornness applied correctly could move mountains or at least save a few wolves. Sheriff Cordell came by 2 days later, accompanied by Samuel Hodge, both men looking grim and official. They searched the barn and found nothing but an old horse and straw that showed no signs of recent wolf habitation. Samuel insisted there had been wolves here, demanded to know where they'd gone, accused Garrett of hiding them. But the sheriff was a fair man who dealt in evidence, and without tracks or scat or any physical proof, he couldn't justify taking action. He told Garrett to be careful, that grief could make a man do strange things. But there was something in his eyes that suggested respect rather than concern. As they left, Samuel promised this wasn't over, but his threats rang hollow in the clean winter air. Spring came eventually, as it always did, melting snow and revealing the land beneath. Garrett worked the ranch, not with his former enthusiasm, but with steady competence, rebuilding what had been let go during the dark months. He heard stories from passing travelers about a she-wolf in the mountains who was teaching her 3 growing pups to hunt, about how they'd been spotted occasionally, but always managed to disappear before hunters could organize pursuit. The traveler said the smallest pup was the boldest, approaching within sight of camps sometimes as if curious about the humans she'd once lived among. Garrett never saw Luna or the pups again, not in the flesh. But sometimes on clear nights he'd stand outside and look toward the mountains, toward the wild country where things that should have died had instead survived, and he'd feel a connection to something larger than himself. He'd saved 4 lives that the world considered worthless, and in doing so, he'd saved something in himself he thought was dead and buried with Martha. He learned that survival wasn't about being strong enough to endure alone, but about being brave enough to care for something beyond yourself. Even when caring was harder than giving up, the barn eventually got new residents as Garrett slowly rebuilt his herd. The ranch came back to life, not to what it had been before, but to something different and perhaps better. And on winter nights when storms rattled the walls, Garrett would sometimes sit in Martha's chair and remember a season when a desperate wolf and a broken man had found in each other the reason to keep fighting, keep surviving, keep choosing life over the easier surrender to darkness. He'd remember and be grateful for the unlikely gift that had been given to him by a creature of the world called Savage, the gift of remembering how to be human in the ways that truly mattered. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to have you join our community. Please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories of survival, hope, and the unexpected connections that change lives. Share your thoughts in the comments below about what you think happened to Luna and her pups, and let us know what kind of stories you'd like to hear next. Your support helps us bring you more tales of courage and redemption from the wild frontier. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most unlikely friendships teach us the most important lessons about what it means to truly live. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.